Hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Marie-Blanche, the host of the Student Wellness Project. This is a podcast for students who want to not only survive the semester, but actually thrive. Welcome to the show, everyone. This is the third episode of the Student Wellness Project, and today we're talking about resilience with Dr. Diana Brecher. And I'm so excited to be speaking with Dr. Brecher because when I took her positive psychology and personal growth course a year ago, which she was co-teaching with Dr. Dina Kara Schaefer, it changed my life. And I know it sounds a bit cheesy or maybe a bit extreme, but it really did. It opened my eyes to the way that we can take charge of our own happiness, sometimes with just little shifts in our attitudes or habits. And I hope that this podcast episode will be able to do the same for you, if only on a micro level. So if you're feeling a bit wiped out in these last weeks of the semester, I know I am, or like your brain is fried, I invite you to give yourself some TLC. So take this episode with you while you get a nice stretch, a bath, or chilling, drinking a cup of tea, whatever you want. Let's jump right into the conversation with Dr. Brecher, and I'll see you on the other side. Hi, Dr. Brecher, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you today. And I just wanted to get you quickly introduced to our listeners. So you were, for many years, a clinical psychologist at the Center for Student Development and Counseling at X University. And over the past few years, many years, I guess, you've been interested in the field of positive psychology, which led you to create many initiatives and programs at X University, including Thriving in Action. But I know that you've probably worn many different hats throughout your career, and there's no one better than you to know exactly what those were. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. So in the 25 years that I spent working in the counseling center as a clinical psychologist, my work was quite varied, actually. So I did psychotherapy with students, and I supervised staff. I ran an internship training program. I taught clinical psychology courses both at University of Toronto and at Ryerson. And I was the director of the counseling center for 17 years. But in about 2016, I decided what I really wanted to do was to move upstream and to see if I could reach students before they needed counseling help. And so I created a 4-session group for students on our wait list, and we called it Bouncing Back, and it was based on resilience. And each week of those 4 weeks, I taught a different skill related to this model of resilience that I created, and we set it up so that students could enter in at any point. So it didn't have like a start date. Each week, students could come in and come through the 4 sessions. And that was really the genesis of the Thrive RU program and the fivefactor model of resilience that I ultimately developed and have now really been teaching all over campus.
Yeah, and I know that you probably decided to specialize early on in this population. So I'm just curious to know what made you decide that you wanted to work with post-secondary students.
I think it was, I think it was a population that and a stage of life that I find so interesting because it's really in this transition from most students, not all, but most students are transitioning from being a teen to being an adult. And there are a lot of really exciting things that happen during that time, but it's also a potentially vulnerable time. And it just seemed like a wonderful moment in time to be part of that change. And so when I was doing my training, both at the master's and at the doctoral level, I did have experiences training in counseling centers of post-secondary institutions. And then I
Mhm.
realized that was really where I wanted to land. Um, and then I also went and got additional training back in 2016 by attending a 7-month training program in positive psychology through the Flourishing Center. And
Mhm.
it was a 250-hour training course, so it was very robust given that I was working full-time while doing it, so it was weekends and evenings and such. It was basically 7 courses. And it really helped me become very familiar with the field of positive psychology and begin to import what evidence-based research taught me about what's really working to help people flourish.
Yeah, that sounds like a very interesting path. And I think all the students that have known you in some respect over their academic career are very grateful for your work. And I'm especially grateful that our paths collided last year. It was our second semester during the pandemic for those doing fall and winter. And I took PSI, PSY 706. And we studied many models for happiness and well-being and resilience, including your own 5-factor model of resilience that you mentioned a bit earlier. So can we dive a bit into that? And can you give us an overview of what that model is?
Absolutely. So when I was creating that Bouncing Back course for students on our wait list, what I did was I thought about if I could think back to 25 years of what students have in common when they seek help at the counseling center. They had 5 characteristics that seemed very common, and then of course they had their unique experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So one is they tended to often kind of be time travelers. They would worry about the future and kind of ruminate and think about the past, but not be really present oriented. They also tended to be unaware of the good things that were happening in their lives. Good things did happen, but they didn't hover over them. They didn't spend a lot of time savoring them. They just kind of let them pass. They tended to see things from a very pessimistic perspective. They tended to be highly self-critical,
Mm-hmm.
and they tended to give up when they felt overwhelmed, even when their goals were important to them. They just didn't seem to be able to persevere. So I thought if I wanted to teach students to bounce back, to be resilient, I needed to teach them 5 things. I needed to teach them mindfulness so that they could be more present,
Mm-hmm.
gratitude so that they could tap into the good things that are happening in their lives, teaching them the skills associated with optimism so that they can cultivate and generate more hope and optimism in their lives, self-compassion to really counteract that self-criticism, and then finally perseverance or grit, to not give up on your goals when you really want to reach them. And so that's the 5-factor model of resilience: mindfulness, gratitude, optimism, self-compassion, and perseverance.
Yeah, and I guess that they're all very interrelated as well. Like, I know that one practice, and maybe we can talk about it a bit later, but one practice that I remember from taking the course is the 3 good things, and which is kind of a gratitude practice. But what really struck me in looking back on it was it's also so useful for optimism, because then with recognizing 3 good things that happen to you every day, you can build that confidence that there are going to be good things every day, and you just have to train that muscle a bit.
Right, exactly. So you're really speaking to some of the interventions that I've kind of curated from evidence-based research out there. What are the interventions or strategies that people can um, exercise or bring into their life on a regular basis that will really help them cultivate all of these different factors. I have a graphic designer actually created this graphic associated with the five-factor model of resilience. And so I think of mindfulness as in the heart of a puzzle almost. And then all the other pieces touch on both mindfulness and each other. So these are all pieces of a puzzle that together kind of build that stamina, build that sense of capacity to either bounce back to where you were or bounce forward to where you want to get to. But there's this sense that you're not stagnating, you're not stuck when you face adversity, because adversity is out there. We all experience it at different times in our lives. And what's different amongst different people is how quickly, how effortful, how much does it cost you to bounce back or move forward?
Yeah, I love that concept of bouncing forward because we're always learning to be better students, perform better, but we have to remind ourselves that we're a person through all of this, and there are other strengths that lie outside of academic life that we can really work towards. So you mentioned that mindfulness is at the center of the model, and then everything revolves around it. So I'm wondering, when a student looks at this, how do they approach it? Is mindfulness at the center because we start with it? How, if you look at that as a roadmap, where would you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. In a way, you can start anywhere, and really, you start with what seems to resonate for you. Which portal do you feel most drawn to? So for some individuals, it might be beginning a very modest mindfulness practice of 3 minutes a day, but doing it every day, and then building it into your life and building the muscles of meditation so that over time you can incorporate more and be able to sit with non-judgment, to be paying attention to what's happening in the present and just sticking with it. So that's one portal through. Gratitude, you mentioned one of the strategies that I taught in class, the 3 good things exercise, which is really simple, which is basically at some point in your day, and often it might be in the evening or before you go to bed, reflect on the day and think about 3 good things that happened, minor or major, something that you had a great deal to do with or you were a passive recipient of. But these good things, and not just what were they, but what role did you play in making them happen? Were you an active participant or a passive recipient? And what does it say, if anything, about you or your future? And you can do this on your own. You can record it in a journal. You can do it at dinner with your family or friends. You can get into bed at night, and as you turn off the light, reflect on these 3 good things. The important thing is, by paying attention, we're actually counteracting that negativity bias that we all live with, which is our predisposition to notice threats or problems and fix them, and to balance it off by noticing the good things that are happening in our lives. And so that's a very simple exercise associated with gratitude that there's been evidence-based research to indicate that it can actually increase your sense of well-being for a fairly prolonged period of time if you do that on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I was listening to your interview with Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman from the Psychology Podcast, and you were talking about optimism, and it really struck me how I maybe dropped that ball. There are other things that are part of my daily life now, but I definitely do tend to not see that I'm not responsible necessarily for things that go wrong in my life, and that I am responsible for some of the things that go really right. So what can a student do to focus on optimism as a practice?
Yeah, I think the myth is that either you're an optimist or you're a pessimist, and them's the breaks. But actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's really about the narrative. It's the way in which we interpret the events in our lives, good and bad, the story we tell ourselves. And so it then becomes a learnable skill to actually tell a different story. So, for example, if you tend to be quite pessimistic when bad things happen, what that really means is that you see that negative event and you say to yourself, well, it's all my fault. It's pervasive. It's going to spill over into other parts of my life, and the impact will be permanent. And what that does is
Mm-hmm.
it kind of like you get stuck in the mud with that. It's really hard to move anywhere from there. Whereas if you interpreted that same negative event from a more optimistic lens, you would have enough energy to regroup and actually do something. So what if you pose certain questions to yourself? And these questions are actually linked to how an optimist would see the world. So the question could be, in what way is this the responsibility of others or circumstances beyond my control? So that's, rather than taking kind of responsibility for it, this is about saying, can I share that responsibility? How can I keep this negative thing temporary? And what must I do to contain the damage of the long-term effects of this event? Okay.
Right.
So what you're doing by posing these questions and attempting to answer them is to actually start thinking about things the way an optimist would. And then if something good has happened and you interpret it from a pessimistic lens, so you're saying this good thing, oh, it was just good luck and it's temporary and situation specific, kind of almost dismissing it. What if you said to yourself, what role did I play in making this good thing happen? So to take some personal ownership of it. How can I make this permanent? What can I do to have this spill over into other aspects of my life? And again, by virtue of asking those questions, you begin to consider the world from an optimistic lens. And we know that hope and optimism are kind of, I think of them as very close cousins. They kind of cover much of the same ground. But hope really is defined by Dr. Shane Lopez, who's a researcher in that area. He talks about it as having the belief that good things will happen, having a positive expectation that they will, and believing that they will.
Mm-hmm.
And that can have a huge impact on how we experience the world. Hope actually has been shown to have a really positive effect on academic performance, on workplace productivity. Being hopeful actually helps you to be more successful, in addition to helping you feel a lot better.
Yeah. So is it cultivated, since they're close cousins, is it cultivated similarly to optimism?
Well, there's actually a bit of a different approach for hope. One is to spend time with hopeful people because they'll both role model hope, and also they're like a little contagious, like their hope kind of generates hope in the people around them. So that's one strategy. Another one is more internally focused, which is identifying specific goals and action plans that you can engage in, and being very systematic about finding a way to create a path to that goal, recognizing that there can be obstacles and that you might have to go around those obstacles. And then it's about sticking to those goals. So it's really bringing in perseverance. So there's this notion that being goal-directed is a way to actually cultivate hope.
Interesting. So I'm curious about those obstacles. Sometimes there are things that come up that we didn't anticipate, and they throw off. Oh la la, my French is coming out. They throw us off track, and so I'm wondering, when those moments happen, how can we learn to be a bit more kind to ourselves, take a step back, and reset towards those objectives?
Yeah, it's a lovely question, and what comes to mind immediately is all the research on self-compassion. So
Right.
when we hit an obstacle and blame ourselves and see it as almost, I knew this would happen, or it's kind of just that this happened, what we're really doing is getting stuck. And so self-compassion is about what we say to ourselves in that moment of regret or obstacle or challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Do we blame ourselves for it, or do we kind of treat ourselves the same way that we would treat our closest friend?
Right.
Could we be our own best friend in the moment we need it the most, where there's kind of kindness and generosity and a recognition of strengths, not kind of pretending that the problem didn't happen, but also saying that you're a three-dimensional person and this didn't go well, but lots of other things have, and to kind of keep it all in perspective. And so that generation or generating of kindness towards oneself, that self-compassion, one pathway to do that is through something like a very particular guided meditation. It's called Loving Kindness, and it is a meditation that enables you to see yourself as connected to others in a really positive way. And that seems to generate more self-compassion in ourselves when we send out kind and generous messages to others, both those who we're close to, those who are acquaintances, and then others in the world that we don't know, and we may never meet, but we still have this sense of let them be well.
Yeah.
Let them be experience life in the best possible way.
Yeah, and I guess that can relate to how we can use the model, but I've realized in the past few weeks that I used to do mindfulness meditations more or less consistently as much as possible, and recently I noticed that I was being very hard on myself, and I kind of shifted to include more loving kindness into my daily life because I remembered that it was a tool that had helped me over the period in which I was in the course, and I just needed to have this feeling at the beginning of my day like I was loved and worthy of whatever was going on in my life, and that just started the day on a very good note in a period where we just have so much pressure to just do, and sometimes when you miss not even a deadline, when you don't follow your plan exactly as you would, then it can start to take a toll. So having that counter action with the loving kindness meditation I found very beneficial.
That's wonderful. And, for those who are listening and might be interested, you can find the loving kindness meditation with, slight variations on the language, but it's in many different places. But we also have it on the Thriving in Action online resource and on the Thrive RU website through SoundCloud. And so I and my colleague, Dr. Dina Kara-Schaefer, we have both recorded different meditations so that if students wanted to just listen to them whenever they were, whenever convenient, they can just download it from SoundCloud.
Oh, great. Wonderful. So we'll be able to link that in the show notes for students. And now can we move on to grit? I'm very curious about that one because I remember studying it, but I feel like it might be a little more complex to implement a practice for grit into our lives. So I'm curious to see what you might suggest.
Sure. I was really inspired by two different psychologists when I put together the interventions that I felt would be most helpful to cultivate grit. The first is Angela Duckworth, who has written a book on grit. And she really defines it as kind of passion and perseverance for very long-term goals, not giving up. And she's done a lot of very interesting research on how growth mindset, for example, fits in with grit, so that attitude towards learning and effort as being something that to be expected can really help with perseverance and grit. But so that kind of conceptually was very useful for me, but it's really the work of Dr. Christine Podesky, who is a clinical psychologist from the US, with whom I've done a lot of training. She developed a personal model of resilience that I then adapted for the Thrive RU program. And so it's really simple. What you do is you think about a time where you have engaged in an everyday type activity, where you have lots of experience with it, that you do for the love of it. So it could be yoga, or riding your bike, or playing a musical instrument, or baking, or knitting, or crossword puzzles, playing chess, whatever it is. So you think about what you really love to do. You have a lot of experience with dealing with obstacles. You have some insight about the obstacles and how you've overcome it. So that's step one. Step two is you actually identify 3 separate obstacles that you have faced in doing this thing that you do for the love of it. And you break it down and you explore, okay, what did I actually do to overcome this obstacle? So what's the behavior? And so you name that. And then what was I thinking? What was I feeling? What were my attitudes about overcoming this obstacle? And you identify those. And you do that for each of the 3 obstacles. And, I give an example of swimming. So I'm someone who loves to swim, and I swim 3 to 7 times a week, and I've done that forever. So I always face some obstacles. So then what happens is you then separate out the swimming, or whatever it is your activity is, from the strategies, and you try to identify strategies that are standalone. They're not contextual to swimming anymore. They're just really useful. And then you take those strategies and you apply it to a completely different challenge that you're facing right now. And the beauty of it is that you trust these strategies and attitudes because they work so well in the context where you're doing something you love. And then you apply it to something where you're kind of feeling less confident and less clear about what you can do. But the strategies are familiar and they're helpful and you know them. And you can then apply them with some modifications to this new context. And when you do that, you actually come to a place where you are able to be gritty or persevere because you're tapping into existing strengths that you know and trust, and you apply in a new context. Because the problem is that people don't often think to do this, to transport. It's like, I think of it as like transposing music to another key. It's still music, it's just going to sound different. There's still good strategies, but you're going to apply them differently. But they're already yours. So all you have to do is apply them. You don't have to learn how to do anything else. You just have to be a little bit creative about how you're going to kind of modify them so that they fit into the new context. And then you test it out and you try it. Whatever works, you keep. Whatever doesn't work, you let go of.
Right. So do you mind giving us an example? You mentioned your swimming, just maybe for one strength that you transposed to something else.
Right. Okay. So an example of swimming was I had a really hard time fitting it into my schedule.
Right.
I work full time and you have to figure out basically like almost an hour and a half of your day between getting to the pool, swimming, showering, and all of that.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So it's a lot to fit in, but I was really committed to it and I did it for the love of it. So I decided one of my strategies was if I didn't have enough time to fit it in, I would just take my lunch hour and expand it a little bit and then stay a little bit later in the day. And I'd kind of give up that rest time of lunch and I'd go for a pool. So my attitude was I was happy to sacrifice my lunch hour in order to get into the pool. When I transposed that strategy to dealing with a personal conflict with someone, it morphed into I'm happy to sacrifice being right in order to reconnect.
Mm.
So it's the same strategy, but it's not identical content because it's in a new context.
Right. So now we talked about all of the different parts of the model, and this episode is going to air about towards the end of the semester, so last week of school, heading into finals. And I'm sure that a lot of people are going to listen to this and say, oh, this all sounds great. I'll try applying it next semester.
Yeah. When I have...
Yeah, exactly. When it's convenient. So what would you say to this person?
Well, there is some truth in that to really dive in deep, you're not going to do that during exam period because you have other priorities, and I completely respect that. However, there are certain elements of this model that can be really helpful around stamina and staying well when you're really stretched too thin. So, for example, they're not specific to this model except by association. Are you going to be getting enough sleep? We know that sleep has a very robust impact on learning and recall and focus and concentration. So if you have a good night's sleep before an exam, you're going to do much better in the exam than if you haven't had a good night's sleep. So can you organize your life so that sleep becomes a priority? Are you going to engage in self-care in all the other ways, eating nutritious food, taking breaks and taking care of your body so that you're not pushing beyond endurance? Are you going to think about what can you do for yourself in self-care before an exam and after? And maybe it's just a 10-minute conversation with someone you truly care about who's going to uplift your mood, or listening to your favorite music, or doing your favorite activity, whatever that is, if it's artistic or exercise, that you punctuate the stressful times with these kind of miniature restorative times. And then maybe you engage in a brief mindfulness every day. There's a 3-minute calming breath, which is also on the Thrive.ru website, which is a great reset button. So can you do that before you sit down and study? Can you think about 3 good things that happened in the course of your day? Can you play with those 3 questions related to optimism and hope? Can you forgive yourself if an assignment or an exam didn't go so well? And say to yourself what your best friend might say to you, which is being kind and generous and supportive. And then finally, can you reflect on what's the strategy that always keeps you going? And can you find a way to tap into that strategy for the day after the day after the day after the day of exam after exam? So in a way, even though this will take some doing to really wrap your mind around the whole thing, can you take small snippets of it? And the workbook that I wrote, Cultivate Your Happiness, the Thrive.ru weekly workbook, has all of these exercises in it. It's a downloadable PDF off of the Thrive.ru website. And then in addition, and in particular, tons of study and learning strategies that my colleague and friend Dr. Dina Kara-Schaefer developed. We created a resource called Thriving in Action Online, and it is a blend of thriving strategies and holistic learning strategies. And there are many resources there that can really help you, including many meditations, but also study strategies, note-taking strategies, how to tap into your basic rest and activity cycle in terms of really honoring the rhythm of the body and how you can tap that and harness it for studying and restorative times, just by way of a few examples.
Right. Well, those all sound like very great strategies, and I hope that they help students, because I know it's not because we're online that the semester is easier. In fact, there's often times many more challenges, especially in terms of motivation. And I just wanted to finish with talking about habits. So these are all practices that, of course, you can do every so often, and they might be beneficial. But it might take a little bit more time for it to either yield results or become a habit. And I know that there's this controversial rule that it takes 21 days to form a new habit. So I'm curious about, what do you think about that? And for all of these practices as a whole or separately, how long will it take for students to feel the results, which often is a motivating factor for it to become a habit?
Okay, so let me break that down because there's like 7 or 8 questions.
Yes.
So first of all, the 21-day myth, it turns out that it's just an urban myth. It was actually based on the amount of time it takes for an individual who's had plastic surgery on their face to get used to their face. So it really has nothing to do with habits, but somehow it migrated into the urban myth of a habit. Research actually suggests, this is by Wendy Wood, she's done a ton of research, she's an academic, on how long does it take for certain habits or certain behaviors to become automatic, in other words, a habit. And it will vary depending on how complex the activity is. Right. So exercise, for example, to do it without thinking, which is a definition of a habit, it's a behavior that you do without having to think about it, can take up to like 90 days more or less before something becomes habitual. Wow. Same thing with how long does it take to eat healthily. It takes somewhere between 60 and 90 days, and it will range. The idea is this, it's very simple. About 43% of the time, all of us do things without thinking about it, both good habits and bad habits. So that's almost 50%. I mean, that's a lot of the day that we do things without thinking. In order to form a habit, you have to first engage in that behavior often enough for it to become automatic.
Right.
And so you need to have a cue in the environment that reminds you this is time to do this new behavior. You have to have a reward associated with the behavior, either a reward that happens by doing it or a reward that you associate with that behavior. And you have to crave that reward. So that's really important. You want to remove friction, so anything that will keep you from doing that activity. And you can do that in lots of different ways. And it's really helpful if you're accountable to someone else. So do you tell someone you're planning to exercise regularly or meditate regularly or go to the gym or whatever it is that you want to start doing? And then can you get support from them? And so habit formation is in many ways, there's a methodology to it, and it's pretty straightforward, and you can engage in it over time. Breaking a habit, or like breaking an addiction, is a more complex procedure, but it's the same principles, which is you have a cue, you have the behavior, and you have the reward. And each time you get the reward, it will reinforce that cue to do that behavior. So don't rely on willpower for a habit, because that's a finite resource. You want to actually think of it as laying down a path to a behavior. And the more clear the path is, the easier it is for you to do it.
Right. Something that really jumped out from what you were saying was rewards for me. So I'm guessing that eating chocolate or ice cream every time you exercise is not the type of reward that we're talking about. So can you expand on that a bit? Sure.
So I have a friend who loves, who does the treadmill every day because he thinks it's a good thing for his health, and he's right. But he finds it incredibly boring. So what he does is he has like a hidden pleasure associated with it. He watches the Netflix shows that his partner doesn't like, but that he really does like, only when he's on the treadmill. So he's now paired this pleasure, this guilty pleasure, with something that he knows is good for him. And so he's getting a reward, not inherently from the actual exercise, but from what he's doing while he's doing the exercise. So that's a way that you can pair the reward. For other people, the actual activity itself is rewarding. So for me, swimming was the reward in itself. I didn't need to pair it with anything else because I loved being in the water.
Right. Well, I'm sure that now we know that we can use rewards, removing friction, which is trying to make it as accessible as possible, and also to have accountability and support to start these new habits. So I think that gives students a great place to start with these practices. And I want to come back to kind of the resources that we've talked about throughout the show. So you mentioned a booklet that people can download. Is that accessible for everyone, including people who are not at Ryerson University?
Yes, all the resources are accessible to, they're open source.
Great.
So the ThriveRU website has the Cultivate Your Happiness weekly workbook. It's got meditations, it's got flashcards, it's got various other things that you can check out. And then the Thriving in Action online resource is also open source, and it has many, many activities related to both holistic learning strategies, so great ways to love being a student. That's the question that Dina and I posed when we created the resource. And also kind of a curated, holistic, positive psychology, thriving, resilience-related resources. We also offer this as a live 10-week program through Student Wellbeing, which is the department where we both work. So students can do this for free. It's 10 weeks for an hour and a half each week from the third week of term on. We also teach this as a 4-credit course, the Thriving in Action curriculum, through the Faculty of Arts, which is, it's an open elective called SSH 102. So this is another way to kind of access all of this information.
Yes, and I can say, well, I took it under a different name, but I can say that having this program as a course that counts for credit really helped me be more mindful and active in the program, because you just count it as a course, something that you have to participate in every week, and it's really beneficial.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Great to hear that.
Yeah, I've definitely recommended it to a lot of students at Ryerson specifically. So I think that concludes everything that I wanted to ask you about, and I'm very, very thankful that you took the time to speak to me and by extension to all the listeners today, and I wish you the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Wow, what a great discussion that was. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. And I just wanted to give you guys a little recap as usual, so you can implement the practices that Dr. Brecher talked about into your daily life when this episode is over. So Dr. Brecher's model for resilience has 5 factors: mindfulness, gratitude, optimism, compassion, and grit. And while she imagines this model as a puzzle with mindfulness in the center, there is no real prescription for where to start. Instead, Dr. Brecher encourages us to start with the factor that resonates with us the most. So if you are a time traveler who often thinks about the past or the future, you can turn to mindfulness meditation as a way to help you reconnect with the present moment. Even a 3-minute daily practice can make a difference. And there are tons of different apps out there for guided meditation. I know it can be overwhelming sometimes. So I'm just going to tell you my personal favorite is Smiling Minds. Everything is free on there, not like some other meditation apps, which we won't mention the title of. And the meditation guides have an amazing Australian accent, so just a little bonus. And that's it for mindfulness. Now, if you forget to hover over the good and even great moments in your life, you can try the 3 good things exercise, in which you note what good things happened in your day, what your role was in making them happen, and what, if anything, does that mean for your future? If you tend to blame yourself for things that go wrong in your life and or attribute positive events only to outside factors, it might be time to turn to an optimism practice. I've written down the 3 questions to develop optimism in the episode's description. And if you're sometimes or oftentimes hard on yourself, you can try to shift your perspective to treat yourself like you would a friend. Loving kindness meditations can also be really helpful to develop self-compassion. And finally, when you're facing a difficult situation, try to find a time when you overcame obstacles and see how these skills that you developed can apply to your new challenging situation. I've also linked the full exercise for grit in the description box. Dr. Brecher also discussed how habits often take more than 21 days to form. For complex habits like changing eating habits and implementing exercise goals, it might even take up to 90 days. She mentioned that an instrumental part in creating new habits is to have a reward associated with the behavior that we want to adopt, whether it's intrinsic to the habit, like her love for swimming, or something we pair with it. Think watching your favorite Netflix show while running on the treadmill. And that's it for this episode, friends. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the episode. It lets me know that you're listening and enjoying this. You can find all the resources that were mentioned in the episode in the description box, so feel free to check out the ones that interest you the most. And as we wrap this up, I'm really curious to know what practice you're thinking of implementing first, or whether you're already using one of these strategies. So leave me a comment down below to let me know. And I just wanted to tell you that as finals roll in, I'm going to be taking care of myself and taking time off of the podcast, so I won't be publishing an episode in the next few weeks. And I hope that you take care of yourself too in these incredibly busy times. And I'll talk to you soon. See you next time. Bye-bye.